Salutare și bine te-am găsit în un nou interviu aici pe start-up.ro. Suntem la începutul 2020, am chiar să spun 2019. Reluăm seria noastră de interviuri video cu antreprenori care ulterior se transformă și în podcasturi. Puteți să urmăriți practic anul acesta așa cum doriți. Puteți să citiți articolul pe Startup, puteți să vă uitați la video sau să ascultați podcasturi. Și primul interviu anul acesta este despre antreprenoriat social. E un context bun să vorbim despre asta pentru că din ce în ce mai multe business-uri se uită și la modul în care nu doar să facă bani, ci să se implice în societate, să fie sustenabile și asta nu este doar despre protecția mediului, ci despre multe alte aspecte. Și am alături de mine, iar interviul acesta va fi în engleză și voi trece acum pe limba engleză, I will switch to English, pe Emanuele Musa, CEO of Babele, Romanian startup doing social entrepreneurship, engaged with now the makerspace at the accelerator level up. Welcome, Emanuele.
Hi, thank you. Salut.
So let's talk a bit about what do you do, just a bit of background for the people who are watching or listening.
Sure. So I created a company called Babele. So I left Procter & Gamble. I was working as innovation manager in Paris 7 years ago. And I decided to move to Romania. I didn't know what Babele or Babele meant. So like wrong name. Everybody started asking whether it was like something related to the Sphinx or Bunici and so on. And the goal was actually at the time to implement a vision for which I wrote my MBA thesis in Brazil. And the goal was how can we actually do crowdsourcing for social good projects. And crowdsourcing, not crowdfunding, putting money, crowdsourcing meaning people putting their skills, time and competencies to develop projects for the greater good. And we came in Romania, we developed this first online platform connecting social innovators with mentors from all over the world. And little by little, we started actually understanding how to coordinate crowds of people to work together in an effective way on the creation of projects that had to be economically viable, but at the same time, they also had to promote some kind of social or environmental impact. And that's where everything started.
And how did the company change over the years? I mean, from the initial idea of connecting social innovators with companies, how did it change? What's doing today?
So let's talk about the first pivot. First, we needed a revenue model, which helps. The main problem was the following, is that this was the period of the sharing economy. Everyone was trying to create a marketplace where someone could actually provide something and someone else could actually be exactly matched with who they need. And we were trying to do the same for social business modeling. I write something and you may be my mentor and give me feedback. The big problem was on how people understand mentoring. And I may involve you and someone else to be mentors of my startup. You may have completely different understanding on what I need or how to do mentoring and so on. And so it always needed a facilitator, and that was not scalable at all. And so at some point we said, there was actually a university, Copenhagen Business School, that said, we really like your approach of engaging stakeholders. We have a massive open online course on social entrepreneurship with 20,000 people that we are having in Coursera. And people are simply looking at lectures, but we would also want to have some kind of more practical laboratory online for people to actually co-create social projects based on the lectures of CBS. And that's when everything started. We started creating the first communities in which they were bringing the program, meaning the beginning and end, and milestone and assignment. They were bringing facilitators. They were bringing the innovators. They were bringing the mentors. And then we simply became expert at not only how do you provide a tool, but how do you actually create user journeys for people so that there can be engagement throughout the innovation process so that people don't disengage.
Before continuing talking about Babele, you had a very interesting trajectory in your life. Basically, you said that you worked in Paris for Procter & Gamble. You did the MBA in Brazil.
Yeah.
And now you're living and doing business in Romania, being an Italian in the first place. So how did it end? How did you end up in Romania? How did you come here and start a business here?
I have the impression that that's always because of a woman. Yes, I've been living in many countries. I've been living also in Belgium or London, and I would have never imagined that I would have ended up in Romania. And so also for all my friends, they were like, Romania? What exactly are you doing there? And the point was, I started this company, this social enterprise, with my wife. She was not my wife when we met. And we were both working. She was at Deloitte in Paris. She's Romanian, and I was at P&G. And then we were simply working during the night, and we noticed that we were not advancing at all. And so she was actually the one who said, "Listen, either we do it and it becomes something real, or like we give up to like spending time at night and we dance tango." And then I said, okay, let's do both. So we decided to quit our jobs, but remaining in Paris would have been very expensive. I come from Italy, but in Sardinia, which is a kind of Maramureș insular, which is great if you want to produce cheese. But if you want to make a startup on crowdsourcing, that would be probably the last place in the planet. And so like the option to actually go in Romania made a lot of sense. And so we said, yeah, let's go there for 1 year. And then after 6 years, I got 2 babies here. I speak the language somehow. And so like we are not going anywhere anytime soon.
And how did you went from working in a big corporation, Procter & Gamble you mentioned, to being interested in social entrepreneurship and social businesses, basically?
So everything, like actually the main interest first started in the concept of participatory democracy. And when I wrote the master thesis already in 2009, the goal was how can actually democracy enable people not only to vote for someone who's going to be taking decision for them, but eventually like enable people to be more and more involved. And in the future in which many people may lose their job because of AI, I think that this is like still makes even more sense. And so like, and I would say that it was also a lot about the readings, like it depends on what you read. I've been reading Jeffrey Sachs since I was 20 years old, and all these books about how do you actually combine business and impact in a way that you're not applying a linear approach to the economy to a finite planet. That is not going to last too long.
And coming back to our previous discussion about how Babele works, basically inside the platform, connecting the social innovators with companies. And it's very difficult for marketplaces because it's always balancing demand and the needs of a company, of the social innovators. How do you find basically projects to grow the platform? How did you find it in the past? Did you approach the companies who wanted to develop a project, maybe a social project, or the innovators themselves?
So at the very beginning, we were simply approaching network of social innovators. And then when we started actually working with accelerators and incubators in universities, having programs to support social entrepreneurs, every time that we were creating a new workplace for their accelerator and incubator, we would also automatically get tens or hundreds of social innovators. And right now we have more than 1,000 from 116 countries. And they also came with their mentors, and they also came with their lecturers and their investors. And so it's becoming an overly richer community. And the main goal right now is becoming the one of how do you make sure that between all these communities that are all serving the same purpose of benefiting not only the company, but also like stakeholders and the planet and so on, how can you make sure that they can cross-pollinate ideas, share best practices, and solve the problem of fragmentation that it exists today in the whole market of social entrepreneurship?
And how do you solve this?
This is like a value proposition also to them, but it's less important than first working effectively with their own stakeholders, because all these programs and universities and companies, they have like very large stakeholders network. And I think that all of these organizations are struggling to tap effectively into the collective knowledge of these groups of people. And in my opinion, it's like in crowdfunding, the famous 3F, family, friends, and fools. you first want to work well with family and friends before you actually get to the fools. So like the first approach is the one of helping them achieve effective collaboration among all the different stakeholders, so that we have a strategy for how to involve each of them. And then like we look at how they can potentially source mentors or experts or startups or any other kind of resource or best practices from the other programs. And one thing that right now everyone is asking me, for example, is about the methodologies. If this is like, imagine it like as a network of accelerator, every accelerator has its own approach or business model canvas or framework to work with the startups. And there is so much content that is being created that can be shared with other programs that allows people to stop reinventing the wheel and to actually start using what's available and to create unique methodologies that are blending different approaches created by different organizations.
Nowadays, we see big companies talking a lot about changing their approach. It's not just about simple business, just profit, but doing social good. But sometimes it feels like a buzzword. It feels like we're talking about maybe a CSR project or something like this. So in order to have a genuine social business, even if we're talking not from the start, but transforming the business into a social one, what are the key elements that you need to have to call yourself a real social business?
I would say that everything starts from understanding the value that you have for stakeholders. And the typical old-style CSR approach, I can say, for example, what Procter was doing like 7 years ago in Paris was the one of saying, okay, fantastic. Our CSR approach is to donate money to the Restaurant du Coeur, which is a NGO that serves food to the homeless people in Paris, which is wonderful, but has nothing to do with what the company is doing. And another issue, for example, that can be that, like I remember it was very urgent in France at that time, is the pressure that large companies can put on transport companies, haulier, like that have a lot of trucks and so on, is huge. They go to them and they say, okay, this year you need to actually lower the price, otherwise I'm going to give the contract to someone else. And so like many of these companies, they end up taking, for example, some Romanian hauliers that were paid below the minimum salary. So it was somehow disrupting the market for the sole interest of the company without looking at the impact that the company has in the whole value chain. And so I think that everything starts from like the understanding that everything that you do has an impact or it's impacting you, like is impacting different stakeholders, and understanding how you actually want to work with these stakeholders. For example, like companies today like Ben & Jerry's that are working together with the producers of some of the flavors for their ice creams, or the same thing for Patagonia. I'm sure you know the brand. They are going beyond the production of bio cotton, and they are trying to really have a perfect fairness all along the value chain. Or for example, a beautiful example, I don't know if you know on the electronic industry, it's called the Fairphone.
I heard about it. Yeah, made with basically PCs that you know where they came from, not with
conflict material
from Africa.
Congo. Because nobody knows that 1 million people died in Congo in the past 10 years. So like simply to serve the columbite tantalite, which is one of those metals that you find in everyone's phone. And nobody's talking about that. And this guy said, okay, we're going to do like an Android phone that works perfectly like everybody else, but is going to be not using any kind of conflict material. We're going to be paying a fair wage to all the people working in China to produce this phone, because it would be impossible to produce it somewhere else at a competitive price point. And they are making sure that it is recyclable and as reusable, like all the parts in as much as possible, and is really trying to be as conscious as possible in everything that they are doing. And I think that that's the very first starting point. Like start not looking at only you, but at the whole landscape as like the place where you should be having an impact.
But I think that there's a pressure from people from maybe Generation Z as they are called, the young people, to know more about their products, the products they are using, where do they come from, who's making them, and what are the conditions of making them. But in the end, how do you approach companies in order to insert this change into their workflow? Because sometimes you can say, okay, we can do this the proper way, but the cost will be higher. The competition doesn't have a higher price, so we're going to lose market share. How do you convince company in order to change their approach?
So the first thing is awareness. I don't think that I think that it's interesting. It was in the past few years that we really started seeing a lot of information on global warming, for example. And if I would ask you 10 years ago, like the difference in information, it was like much lower. It was huge. There was not as much information. So keep educating people, not only on some of the buzzwords that there are today regarding global warming, but for example, usage of water or usage of sand, that are the two most used elements in nature, and like the impact is humongous. Until people are not aware, it's going to be difficult to do any kind of to imagine any kind of change anytime soon. So education first. And then second part is like the government plays a fundamental role. I think that those countries in which the government 4 years ago, when they signed the Sustainable Development Goals, 190 governments subscribed them. In Sweden, they speak about the Sustainable Development Goals like on a weekly basis in television. I have never seen this in Romania. And I'm sorry, but like the government has signed this kind of global goals that we should achieve in 10 years, which is pretty much tomorrow. And it is also their responsibility not only to raise awareness, but also like to start coming up with multi-stakeholders collaborations to understand how the society as a whole is going to be achieving those goals. Because there is not one strategy that can be applied on every country, because if you take Norway and if you take Romania, they may have different sustainable development goals they want to focus on. So every country has the responsibility to start aligning all these different stakeholders, and it's much more difficult only for the private sector to do it on its own. So I really think that it is like a multi-stakeholder approach that requires collaboration, and it shouldn't be left only to the power of every company to do the best they can. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to measure impact in a way that is relevant. And, like we're really still waiting for this kind of coordination to happen.
Talking about Babele again, and the kind of projects you are doing in the Romanian market, for example, can you give us some examples of those projects you worked on?
Yeah, definitely. Like we launched an accelerator program together with like for the first accelerator program actually for makers and designers in Europe. That's important to mention it. And the focus was the one of combining our work with accelerators with what we found at Not Makerspace, which is a very lively community of makers and mesterșugari and artisans and so on. And we wanted to do something that is not just focusing on the next fintech mobile app, but we wanted to work with physical products. And it was a fantastic project that we developed together with Bosch and Banca Transilvania and the startups. We supported them throughout 9 months. And right now we're preparing for the next batch in 2020. And right now we started also creating social entrepreneurship programs inside large companies. So there is one that we're launching for a financial institution, and we're going to be involving their employees in, first of all, getting some more entrepreneurial education and supporting NGOs. And if I can be honest with you, I think that is one of the most important lever in order to start transforming the company culture, because everyone is talking about self-management and reversing the pyramid and so on, all this kind of cultural change that are happening in many companies. And for the sake of innovation, getting people to actually be more entrepreneurial is actually the first starting point to start seeing people contributing to design what should be like the company vision, and to therefore also bring their own personal values to how the company should develop from a sustainable or environmental perspective.
And in your opinion, because you talked about this project on social entrepreneurship inside a big financial institution in Romania that you're going to launch, how do you get to involve the people from the company? Because when you have this kind of project, it has to be voluntary.
Yeah.
People need to feel the need to engage with this kind of project. How do you make them work? And how do you make them not feel that they are working extra hours for a project of such kind?
So like the first thing is that you don't start with something big. That's one of the things that actually has been killing plenty of intrapreneurial projects in large organizations. Like a CEO that one day woke up and said, today we're going to be launching a mega entrepreneurship program that is going to be as inclusive as possible. You try to involve too many people, then for some reason it doesn't work, too much complexity, you no longer know what was the problem, and it's going to be very difficult to repropose the same project the next year. So the first thing is to start small and to start only with so-called early adopters or innovators in the company, so that you avoid all the grumpy people to actually not being involved immediately, because what you're trying to create is actually a success story. If you can create a success story with some people that are enthusiastically understanding, what's the impact and the scope of the program, then you're going to have less complexity to manage in order to have them engaged. You're going to be focusing on just getting some results that can shine in front of every other employees, and you can start converting the other employees that are the early majority interested in this kind of forma mentis or like modus operandi in the company, so that you can redo a second program, improving from what you learned in the first one, and also getting people that are understanding what's that about and that may be also motivated. So you don't change companies like with a one big program that is going to last 1 year. That is impossible. I give always the example of General Electric, for example. They are training 40,000 employees on the lean startup in order to actually have people being able to talk at the same level. And this takes time. You're not going to do this in 1 year.
And what they are going to do in this project you're implementing this year? Let's explain the way it works for all the people to understand.
Yeah, it's very easy. So there is a triple bottom line. The first one is the one of making sure that the employees in this financial institution can actually have a closer relationship with small medium enterprises. The second one is the one of educating about the entrepreneurial skills, those people, so that they can also have an introspection on how this can be applied in their company and what they do on a daily basis. And the third part is the one of having an impact, And so we decided to actually pick 4 NGOs that are really doing an effort to transition towards a sustainable business model, so becoming a social enterprise. And this is an issue because only in the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, we lost 100,000 NGOs because their business model is not allowing them to be enough like self-sufficient, and so they may simply perish if there is a financial crisis. And we're gonna be inserting those NGOs into an acceleration program in which the directors of these institutions are gonna become the mentors of these NGOs, and they're both gonna be attending some master classes on design thinking, on lean startup, on how to do customer development, and so on. And we're gonna help the employees of the financial institution to further understand how this works in a concrete context, which is the one of NGOs that are already doing some work on how to transition into a social enterprise, and by become mentors, because when you mentor someone, it becomes even more, it sticks even better in your brain what you're actually trying to explain to people. And at the end of the program, there should be like an introspection from the employees to understand what they actually learned, and on the entrepreneurial skill set, how to combine business and impact, and potentially bring all of these learnings with their colleagues in the institution.
I think that a big part of the program, and in general, it's entrepreneurship education. And we're talking a lot about how can we, as a country, as a society, can improve this entrepreneurship education. In your opinion, what is lacking right now, and how do you do it properly? And when do you start? Do you start in school? Do you start in companies with people that are already working? Maybe they do not want to become entrepreneurs. They do not want their own business.
So I think like you should start as early as possible, and the reason is like the beauty about the entrepreneurial education is that allows you to prepare for periods of uncertainty, and I think that nobody knows exactly how the society is going to look like in 2050, and having the capability of knowing how to adjust and reinvent yourself is going to be fundamental. The way to do it is definitely the one of getting people into the context, and so I think that there should be like a much stronger collaboration between academic institutions with real entrepreneurs, so that like the whole junior consultancy approach, I find it very educative, because you as a student, you can actually get to understand the context of an entrepreneur, who can actually use the student in order to crowdsource ideas to certain challenges and so on. So I think the context is very important, and most of all, enabling people to actually try the experience and really go through all the pain that means actually coming up with a wrong idea, having to change it, and failing, and understanding that failure is actually okay. And I think that there is a big stigmatization of failure, like in most of the European countries, and that is making it difficult for young people to actually embrace the entrepreneurial career as one that could help them to fulfill their dreams.
Have you had collaborations with universities, with the academic world in Romania or in Europe?
Yeah, I've been giving talks like at ASE, and meeting the students of the social entrepreneurship class, and I've been talking about what social entrepreneurship about, and giving as many examples as possible so that people could understand what are the thousands different ways that entrepreneurs have been positioning into the spectrum of impact, while trying to combine the difficulty of sometimes subsidizing difficult social impact, because when you work with illiterate people in rural areas, you may not have an easy revenue model, and so like all the creative ways that these people have found to sustain themselves while trying to achieve this impact.
You talked about NGOs and trying to transform them into social enterprises. And from what you've seen, what are the main mistakes they are doing when developing the NGO? The wish of doing good is there, but in the end, as you said, most of them have problems getting funds, raising money, and what solutions do they have to have a more sustainable business model in the end?
Yeah, so there is nothing. So like my first conclusion is that not every NGO is going to transform into a social enterprise, and that's absolutely fine. Absolutely fine. We're gonna still need non-profit organizations that do not need to create a business on the side in order to sustain whatever they're doing for social impact. You know, like I don't think that that's everyone's destiny, and that's absolutely fine. Like there are three different kind of models for an NGO or for a social enterprise actually to exist. One is the one in which the social impact and the business activity is the same. You can think about micro donations or micro funding, in which like all the funding that people are lending to social entrepreneurs, then the company is actually going to get also a minimum return on investment on that, and so like your social impact and your business activity is the same. In some cases there is an overlapping, or in other case you have completely different businesses to manage actually your non-profit activity. I can give you one example. Here in Romania, there is the kindergarten where I actually bring my kids, which is a social enterprise created by an American woman that came in Romania 20 years ago. And she started with a orfelinat in Buzău, which was like the classic non-profit that only survives through donation. And then she did a coșu cu legume from Buzău to Bucharest. And then she did like this kindergarten with a neo-humanistic approach, which are the two social businesses that subsidize the work that the orfelinat is doing. So I think that it gets to have a lot of complexity in order to make sure that your filling up can actually sustain itself and can exist without just relying on donations. So I think that that's the major problem of all these NGOs, is that it requires a lot of entrepreneurial mindset to actually make it happen. And it requires resources because you're setting up or managing pretty much 2 or 3 businesses in this case at the same time.
I think we don't actually think when we see an NGO that it's basically more complicated than a usual business. As you said, you have maybe 3 businesses in the same time that are supporting each other and are interconnected.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the accelerator you developed with Not Makerspace called Level Up in 2019 for the makers. What are the plans for 2020? You said that you expect a new batch. And what did you see in the first edition? Because you were focused on makers, not on tech businesses like most accelerators, and on this process of collaboration and co-creation.
Mm-hmm. So what we noticed in 2019 is that it's very difficult for every entrepreneur to pivot or to iterate. You may come with an idea, you may discover that actually doesn't work, and then you're constantly facing this question of should we change something or should we continue in this direction? Perhaps it's a matter of time, and the whole methodologies that every accelerator is teaching today is how to be as scientific as possible in the way that you can actually take this kind of decisions. And you can see like really this human struggle on the scientific approach, like in something like as human as it can be, like creating a startup. And so it's, I think it's a lot of work from a coaching perspective and not only from a mentoring perspective, from some of the skills such as marketing, how to do a pro forma financial statement and so on. In order to help these people through all the failures that they need to go through before finding the model that actually works. For 2020, like we are actually hoping to be more effective with an open innovation approach to work with companies. What I mean is that we didn't find many companies today that are exploiting open innovation or collaboration with startups in order to achieve some of their objectives. There are some programs in Germany, for example. I've been to Startup Autobahn, which is a mega program organized by Daimler, in which they bring startups from all over the world. They're the directors of the biggest company in Germany, like in that area. And then they work for 1 year to create a pilot with these companies. And these companies, they force themselves to the rhythm of the startup, so that it's also this cultural transformation for the employees in order to be able to achieve a pilot within 1 year. And that is beautiful. I think it's really powerful. I think that is is one of the levers to achieve cultural transformation, and in Romania it's not happening enough. So right now we're simply going to companies and proposing them the opportunity to adopt a startup for the next batch that may be in line with some of the objectives that they want to actually to follow. And it's going to be like our responsibility to find the right mix of startups that are like at a comparable stage of development and that serve the opportunity to work together with a major organization. Because I think that the goal is not only the one to make a startup investment ready, but if we could also find a potential partner that could be a great commercial partner for that startup to scale its business and impact, that would actually be the best win-win both for the corporate and for the startup and for us that we are coordinating this program.
And how do you try to make the companies in the accelerators having mentors giving them feedback, not to accept the feedback because it's not just accepting it, but understanding, because you go to an accelerator as a company and you have 5-10 mentors that give you feedback. And maybe the feedback is totally different. How do you navigate to all this feedback just to have the right idea where to go to your business?
I think it depends on the natural hierarchies that you have on each topic. For example, I can talk about business modeling. I may be the worst person possible to talk about taxation or to talk about a legal entity. And so it's always about understanding, first of all, the role between the mentor and the industry expert, in which the mentor should be a person humble enough to guide you throughout the journey and to help you connecting with the right people, not having an answer for everything. This is like, unfortunately, what many people understand of mentor. Like they see themselves as a demiurgo, instead there should be all these industry experts that you actually call in at the right time whenever you have a specific question regarding a topic. So I think that is the main role that the accelerator facilitators they play in order to coordinate this crowd of people, all willing to help the startups, but also understanding what's the specific role that each of them play.
And I know that, and you mentioned that in every accelerator and every program, it's important to have a good methodology. And I know that you develop basically a methodology inspired by Monopoly.
Yeah. It's called the Startupoly. It's something actually that, I love wasting time on PowerPoint. But the idea is that I think it's easier for people to go through like either a framework that calls you something as playful as Monopoly can be, and most importantly, like it is something that allow me to go, for example, through the whole journey of explaining to a company, to a corporation, how the whole entrepreneurial journey like should actually work. And the framework allows people to remember exactly how each of those different stops in the game translates into different actions and different objectives for the entrepreneur, the mentors, and so on. So it is simply like a framework that allow me to organize the same storytelling that we would have for entrepreneurs.
And regarding Level Up, when will it start in 2020? Do you have a specific...
we are looking at Q2 of 2020. So right now we're going to keep talking with all the different partners, select the startups, and then by the second quarter of 2020, we're going to start the program.
And talking about the startups that came into the program in last year, what did you see? What are their evolution? But maybe the results, if you can give us some examples of companies.
For example, like we had a group of French people that came up with the idea of a bioreactor that you use for producing spirulina, which is a microalgae. And it's considered by the UN one of the superfood that they give into astronauts, the people from NASA. So it's one of the healthiest things that you can possibly have. You can't find it fresh at the supermarket because it expires in 48 hours. So they made something that everyone can have at home. And every week you harvest your fresh spirulina and you mix it with whatever food you're cooking. And in their case, they went from idea of the product to conceiving the product to actually shipping it to restaurants in France and in Romania, and to actually finding groups of people that are testing it at home to actually keep perfecting the whole process of growing the spirulina, harvest it, and make sure that people don't screw up with the process, because you don't want to have a product that comes up with major fallacies when in the production process. And that was interesting because I've really seen the whole thing going from zero to a product that is currently working and for which we tried the food and nobody died, which is already like a great starting point. Or, for example, a student from the University of Design in Bucharest, she came up with a cutlery set for arthritic people, which is something that there are other solutions in other parts of the world. In Romania, nobody's treating it because those solutions are very costly, and there is not really a promotion of the products for this kind of disease. And she went from sketches to design the product to actually start in collaboration with different medical institutions in the countries in order to test it. And it's beautiful to actually see that we had the chance actually to work with the right people and just pushing them in the right direction. And then they did actually all of the work because they were committed enough, and they had a strong will to go where, and see the results they were hoping at the beginning.
And because we're talking about business and we're approaching the end of the interview, and we're interested in numbers here at startup.ro. What are the numbers of Babele? I mean, how did the business grow? What is the level of the business right now?
So like we got 8 employees right now. Like we got 50 accelerators that are currently using the platform, 1,000 social enterprise that we are working with, and the objective to work with at least 10 corporate programs in 2020.
Manu, thank you very much for the interview and for the details, and good luck this year.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Vă mulțumesc că ne-ați urmărit, am trecut acum din nou pe română în această discuție despre cum pot companiile să se implice, să fie mai responsabile și până la urmă să aibă și profit, să facă și bine. Eu am fost Vlad Andriescu, ne găsim pe startup.ro.